Are you looking to use Microsoft Azure Virtual Machines but feel overwhelmed by the intricacies that it entails? In this video, I will explain what Azure VMs are, what the components in it are, and how to set one up in the Azure portal. Azure Virtual Machines, or VMs, are one of the many computing resources that Azure offers. They are on-demand and highly scalable. The purpose of using them is when you need more control over the computing environment than other Azure offerings. Azure Virtual Machines give you the flexibility of virtualization without the need of buying and maintaining the physical hardware. However, you still get to keep your ability to maintain the virtual machine by performing tasks such as configuring, patching, and installing software that runs on it. Your virtual machines can scale horizontally and vertically depending on your current demand. Azure Virtual Machines can be used in various ways. For example, development and test. Azure Virtual Machines offer a quick and easy way to create a computer with specific configurations required to code and test an application. Applications in the cloud. Because demand for your application can fluctuate, it might make economic sense to run it on a virtual machine in Azure. You pay for extra virtual machines when you need them and shut them down when you don't. Extend your on-premises infrastructure. Virtual machines in an Azure virtual network can easily be connected to your organization's network. What do I need to think about before creating a virtual machine? There's always a multitude of design considerations when you build out an application infrastructure in Azure. These aspects of a virtual machine are important to think about before you start, such as the name of your application resources, the location where your resources are stored, the size of the virtual machine, the maximum number of virtual machines that can be created, the operating system that the virtual machine runs on, the configuration of the virtual machine after it starts, and finally, the related resources that the virtual machine needs. Locations. Microsoft data centers for Azure are scattered around the world. Microsoft divides their locations based on geographical regions. Usually, the region is called location when you create a virtual machine. For a virtual machine, the location specifies where the virtual hard disks will be stored. Availability. There are multiple options to manage the availability of your virtual machines in Azure. Availability zones are physically separated zones within an Azure region. Availability zones guarantee virtual machine connectivity to at least one instance and at least 99.99% of the time when you've got two or more instances deployed across two or more availability zones in the same Azure region. Virtual machine scale sets let you create and manage a group of load-balanced virtual machines. The number of virtual machine instances can automatically increase or decrease in response to demand or a defined schedule. Scale sets provide high availability to your applications and allow you to centrally manage, configure, and update many virtual machines. Virtual machines in a scale set can also be deployed into multiple availability zones, a single availability zone, or regionally. An availability set is a logical grouping of VMs that allow Azure to understand how your application is built to provide for redundancy and availability. Each virtual machine in your availability set is assigned an update domain and a fault domain by the underlying Azure platform. Managed disks. Managed disks handle Azure storage account creation and management in the background for you, and ensures that you don't have to worry about the scalability limits of the storage account. You specify the disk size and the performance tier, standard or premium, and Azure creates and manages the disk. As you add disks or scale the virtual machine up and down, you don't have to worry about the storage being used. If you're creating new virtual machines, use the Azure command line interface or the Azure portal to create virtual machines with managed OS and data disks. If you have virtual machines with unmanaged disks, you can convert your virtual machines to be backed with managed disks. Sizes and pricing. The size of the virtual machine that you use is determined by the workload that you want to run. The size that you choose then determines factors such as processing power, memory, storage capacity, and network bandwidth. Azure offers a wide variety of sizes to support many types of uses. Azure charges an hourly price based on the virtual machine size and operating system. For partial hours, Azure charges only for the minutes used. Storage is priced and charged separately. Sizes for virtual machines in Azure. When picking a virtual machine, you can pick which type you want, the choices being general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, storage optimized, GPU, and high performance compute. VM Selector Tool. The Selector Tool is ideal if you're not sure what size, also known as SKU, is right for you. The Selector Tool is where you indicate your workload requirements and technical specifications of your VM. It is divided into 6 different tabs. These tabs are the workload, the technical characteristics of the VMs tab, where you tell how many CPUs and how much memory or RAM you want. In the disk storage tab, you pick your disk type. The choices are premium SSD, standard SSD, standard HDD, and ephemeral OS disk. The operating system tab is where you pick your OS on your VM. And finally, the regions tab is for the geographic location in which your VM will be created. After these simple steps, the tool identifies the best VM and disk storage combination based on the information you enter. You will then be able to view the details of the recommended VMs and their prices. Azure Compute Gallery. An Azure Compute Gallery helps you build structure and organization around your Azure resources like images and applications. An Azure Compute Gallery provides global replication, versioning and grouping of resources for easier management, highly available resources with zone redundant storage accounts in regions that support availability zones. ZRS offers better resilience against zonal failures. Premium storage support, sharing to the community across subscriptions and between Active Directory tenants. Scaling your deployments with resource replicas in each region. With a gallery, you can share your resources to everyone or limit sharing to different users, service principals, or Azure AD groups within your organization. Resources can be replicated to multiple regions for quicker scaling of the deployments. Now that we understand the basics, let's make our own VM. You can find the VM creation tool in the search bar by typing virtual machines. You can then click create at the top left of your window. Page 1, Basics. The Basics tab is where we will define our resource variables such as the subscription, the resource group where the VM lives, instance details for the VM, the region where it is hosted, for example, East US, availability options such as availability zone, VM scale set, and availability set. Security type refers to the different security features available for a virtual machine. Standard, trusted launch, virtual machines, and confidential virtual machine. Image is where you pick your OS image. You can get choices like Windows Server Data Center, Ubuntu, Red Hat, and many more. VM architecture provides a choice of x64 or ARM64 based virtual machines to run your applications. Run with Azure Spot Discount offers unused Azure capacity at a discounted rate versus pay-as-you-go prices. Size is to select a VM size to support the workload that you want to run. Authentication type. Choose whether the administrator account will use username and password or SSH keys for authentication. Username. Define the administrator username for the VM. SSH public key source. You can either generate a new key pair, use an existing key stored in Azure, or use an existing public key. Inbound port rules. Select which virtual machine network ports are accessible from the public internet. Public inbound ports. Choose between none or selected ports. By default, access to the virtual machine is restricted to sources in the same virtual network and traffic from Azure load balancing solutions. Selected inbound ports. You pick between HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, or all of them. Page 2. Disks. Azure VMs have one operating system disk and a temporary disk for short-term storage. You can attach additional data disks. Virtual machine disk encryption. Azure Disk Storage Encryption automatically encrypts your data stored on Azure managed disks at rest by default when persisting it to the cloud. Encryption at host. Encrypts temporary disks and ephemeral OS disks with platform managed keys, OS, and data disk caches, with the key specified in the key management dropdown and flows encrypted to the storage service. OS disk type. Choose between premium SSD, standard SSD, and standard HDD. Key management. A disk encryption set stores the customer key that a disk or snapshot will use for encrypting its data. You choose between an existing disk encryption set during this step. Enable ultra-disk compatibility. Azure Ultra Disks deliver high throughput, high IOPS, and consistent low latency disk storage for Azure Infrastructure as a Service VMs. Data disks. You can add and configure additional data disks for your virtual machine or attach existing disks. This VM also comes with a temporary disk. In the Advanced tab, you will find Use Managed Disk. For best performance, reliability, scalability, and access control, we recommend Azure Managed Disks for most virtual machine configurations. Use Unmanaged Disks if you need to support certain classic scenarios or want to manage disk VHDs in your own storage account. Ephemeral OS Disk. Ephemeral OS disks are created on the local virtual machine storage and are not persisted to the remote Azure storage. Ephemeral OS disks can be stored on VM cache or VM temp resource disk if sufficient space is available. Page 3. Networking. This is where you define network connectivity for your virtual machine by configuring network interface card settings. You can control ports, inbound and outbound connectivity with security group rules, or place behind an existing load balancing solution. Virtual network. Virtual networks are logically isolated from each other in Azure. You can configure their IP address ranges, subnets, route tables, gateways, and security settings, much like a traditional network in your data center. Subnet. A subnet is a range of IP addresses in your virtual network, which can be used to isolate virtual machines from each other or from the internet. Public IP. Register which public IP address you want to use to communicate with the virtual machine from outside the virtual network. NIC Network Security Group. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from the virtual machine. Here, we choose between basic, advanced, or none. Public inbound ports. Simply allow the ports you already selected previously or disable them all. Select inbound ports. Another place to pick your inbound ports being HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, and RDP. Delete public IP and NIC when VM is deleted. Public IP addresses and NICs persist independently from the virtual machine. You can choose to automatically delete the public IP address and NIC when the associated virtual machine is deleted. Enable accelerated networking. Enables low latency and high throughput on the network interface. Load balancing. You can place this virtual machine in the backend pool of an existing Azure load balancing solution. Your load balancing options being the Azure Load Balancer and the Application Gateway. Page 4. Management. Microsoft Defender for Cloud is tied to your subscription. It provides unified security management and advanced threat protection across hybrid cloud workloads. Enable System-Assigned Managed Identity. A system-assigned managed identity enables Azure resources to authenticate to cloud services, for example, Azure Key Vault, without storing credentials in code. Log in with Azure AD. Use your corporate Active Directory credentials to log into the VM, enforce MFA, and enable access via RBAC roles. Enable Auto Shutdown. Configures your virtual machine to automatically shut down daily. Backups. To guard your virtual machine against accidental deletion and corruption, you can configure backup on this virtual machine. Your virtual machine will be backed up to Recovery Services Vault with the configured policy. Guest OS updates. Patch orchestration options allow you to control how patches will be applied to your virtual machine. Page 5. Monitoring. Here is where you configure monitoring for your VM. Alerts. Add commonly used alert rules to get notified on important events happening on your resource. Examples of alerts are percentage of CPU use, network bandwidth, VM availability, and more. Boot diagnostics. Use this feature to troubleshoot boot failures for custom or platform images. Enable OS guest diagnostics. Get metrics every minute for your virtual machine. You can use them to create alerts and stay informed on your applications. Page 6. Advanced. Adds additional configuration, agents, scripts, or applications via virtual machine extensions or cloud init. Extensions. Extensions provide post-deployment configuration and automation. Add new features like configuration management or antivirus protection to your virtual machine using extensions. Choose from dozens of extensions such as Custom Script for Linux, Azure Monitor Agent for Linux, NVIDIA GPU driver extension, and many more. Virtual machine applications. Virtual machine applications contain application files that are securely and reliably downloaded on your VM after deployment. Custom data and cloud init. Pass a cloud init script, configuration file, or other data into the virtual machine while it is being provisioned. User data. Pass a script, configuration file, or other data that will be accessible to your applications throughout the lifetime of the virtual machine. Performance and NVMe. Enable capabilities to enhance the performance of your resources. Host. Azure dedicated hosts allow you to provision and manage a physical server within Azure data centers that are dedicated to your Azure subscription. A dedicated host gives you assurance that only VMs from your subscription are on the host, flexibility to choose VMs from your subscription that will be provisioned on the host, and control of platform maintenance at the level of the host. Capacity reservations. Capacity reservations allow you to reserve capacity for your virtual machine needs. You get the same SLA as normal virtual machines with the security of reserving the capacity ahead of time. Proximity placement group. Proximity placement groups allow you to group Azure resources physically closer together in the same region. Review and create. The review and create page is to confirm your choices. You will see the price of the virtual machine per hour and all your parameters. You can also download the ARM template for the VM you are creating for easy replication. And that's it. Hope you guys learned something, and in the next video we will learn all about virtual machine images in Azure.